Professors of Reddit. Who was the dumbest student you ever had and what was so dumb about them? Story 1. May or may not be dumb, but my friend and I went to her uncle's house, which had this piece of paper framed and put on the wall. It was a 0-20 on a true or false quiz. Her uncle was a professor and was just too impressed by such an achievement that he had to put it in his home. Story 2. A student in my economics class started his final essay with this. We are all familiar with the country, Africa. Yet at the same time, we know little about them. All we know is that it is hot there, African Americans live there, and they are really poor. This begs the question, why is Africa that poor? It was just so jam-packed with stupid I had to stop grading for 24 hours. Edit. For the record, this was indeed a college student. Story 3. Happened in the first week of a college anthropology course. Prof. Let's list a few basic differences between modern humans and animals. Student. We have a heartbeat. Story 4. I didn't believe any student was dumb. She may only have needed the right motivation. Until I met RJ. RJ was dumb. RJ didn't realize that the chicken we eat was the same as the animal. RJ was 21 at the time. Story 5. I had a student who wrote an art history paper about Leonardo da Vinci. Didn't even run that sucker through a spell check or anything. Referred to him as that throughout the entire paper. Thanks to everyone who pointed out that I couldn't spell in my post about spelling things wrong. Story 6. As a GA teaching freshman English, I had a couple instances of cheating that left me speechless. First, my university uses an online plagiarism checker, and the students know this. With one student, over half of his essay was copied from a website. He looked genuinely shocked when I called him out on it, and then told me that his mother wrote the paper for him. I explained that his mother writing his paper was also cheating. Then he asked if he could get credit for the half that wasn't from a website. Another time, the students had to analyze a movie showing how it used the hero's journey as plot structure. This was an easy assignment, seeing as how nearly every modern movie uses this structure. The student copied the Wikipedia summary of Aladdin word for word, and he denied doing it. He argued it was a coincidence that his entire essay was the exact same as Wikipedia's. Story 7. One of my students told me he was going to be 21 when he graduated high school. I asked him why. He explained that he ages 2 years every year. He is 15 turning 16, so that is 2 years. He is probably right that he will not graduate HS till age 21, but not for the reason he mentioned LOL. Story 8. One of my husband's colleagues said a kid came up to him after an exam and said, I didn't know the answers to the questions you asked on the test, so I made up my own questions and answered them. The professor said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And when I go to lunch, I'm going to tell all my friends. Story 9. I had a student plagiarize on the final exam. It was a take-home, essay short answer exam. They knew to cite any sources and to put it in their own words. The kicker? This particularly bright bulb plagiarized me. The professor. She tried to pass off my words as her own. Oi. Edit. Welp, this is by a factor of a whole bunch. I am a qualitative researcher, numbers are not my jam. My most upvoted comment. To address a few common questions. 1. This student copied directly off of class materials I had provided and given no other analysis or work at all. They did not cite their work either. I had instructed them to cite everything, and even given them examples of how to cite the materials I gave them. And, more to the point, they did not show me they understood the material. They showed me they could copy-paste. I was teaching educational psychology, and it was important that they show me their understanding. 2. They did not fail the course. For this reason, I do not recall their final grade. I tossed it up to my department head, and we decided they would not get any credit for the questions they copied, but everything else would be graded normally. I then wrote them a long email explaining why what they did was not acceptable and to not do it again. 3. To the one who told me to eat A. My husband quite enjoyed it the other night when I did so. So, insult failed. Story 10. I didn't have any particularly dumb student, also not a professor but a graduate teaching assistant, but I did mark one essay that began so eloquently with, "Do we born with intelligent?" Edit. As an addendum, because I still find this story hilarious, the second sentence was, "How our cognitive is developed." One of my fellow PhD student marked an essay once which came in at 2 pages. It was a 6-page limit. And half of the essay, so 1 page, discussed Mowgli from the Disney animated version of The Jungle Book. The topic was developmental psychology. Story 11. I saw some amazingly bad attempts at plagiarism in my day. These included 1. Plagiarizing from an article in a journal the professor edited. This was a grad student. 2. Plagiarizing from the same source as another student in the same class. First hit on Google is not your friend. 3. Turning in a sophomore lit survey paper referring to a poet's use of hendecasyllabics. I have a doctoral degree, and I had to look that one up. Googled author's name plus hendecasyllabics, and there was the paper. Only thing the student contributed was her name. 4. When caught red-handed, insisting tearfully that she didn't plagiarize. Her roommate wrote the paper for her, and her roommate was the dirty plagiarist. I was literally speechless for a moment while I grappled with this line of reasoning. Bonus points. This was Ms. Hendecasyllabics. Story 12. I once had a girl in my class ask why meteors always fall into craters. For context, this was journalism degree, and we were talking about libel laws. This girl did not pass. Story 13. I'm not the professor, but I did talk to her about this student at the time. I was taking an online class. Each week we had to answer in a discussion board, in our own words, about whatever the topic was. The answers were all public, to inspire discussion. I researched, took my time writing out the answers. Even though our names showed up, I still signed my name at the end of it. Usually an hour or two after I post my stuff, a classmate would post hers too. Without fail, she would copy and paste what I wrote and claimed it as her answer too. It was clear she never bothered to read it either because she kept my name at the end of it. After seeing this happen over 2 weeks, I emailed our professor and voiced my complaint. She emailed me back and said it's already been noticed by her. The following week, that classmate was no longer on the class roster. I was always curious who would pay that kind of money, just to steal answers and not bother to learn. She wasn't young either. We had profile pages. She was older than me by at least 20 years. Was just bizarre and dumb. Story 14. Actually, one of the smarter kids in my class. Ethics, awareness of social norms. Not so much. He sent me an email after the semester ended, asking if I'd mind telling my next semester class that his digital textbook was available for sale. Oh, and that it's a PDF, so if multiple people want it, he can sell them all copies. I responded that I admire his entrepreneurial spirit, but it probably wasn't a good idea to solicit his professor's help in starting a piracy-based book-selling business. Story 15. I'm not a professor, but a fellow student I was paired with on 4th-year pharmacy. School rotations was abysmally stupid. Our student room that 6 of us would do our assignments and projects in at the hospital was filled with a combination of meme posters created for our preceptor and motivational posters. Well, one poster was of whales breaching the ocean. Well, this one guy, we will call him M, blurts our one quiet afternoon. That poster is so fucking stupid. Why are whales at the top of the water? They don't breathe air? Being bored myself, I indulge him and ask what he meant, to which he responded that whales were fish and thus don't breathe air, they breathe water. This piqued everyone else's interest now, and we tell him that whales are mammals just like dolphins are. He disagrees, saying that anything that swims in the water is a fish. Being the smart that I can be sometimes, I ask him what a penguin is then. He tells us that penguins are just so stupid because they don't realize that they can fly and that all birds fly. I bring up ostriches as an example of a that doesn't fly, and he replies that those are just like mammals. What are bats then? He replies that they are clearly birds. This goes round and around for about 15 minutes until another fellow pharmacy student asks him how he based basic biology or comparative anatomy, both requirements for pharmacy school. He informs us that we are the idiots for actually taking the class, that he took them online and he just paid his sister, who was in med school at the time, to take the assignments and exams for him. It seems like he was trolling us, right? No. This connected so many dots for us. M was known for being just genuinely unintelligent and would ask the most basic questions like what Benadryl is used for at the end of a lecture about allergy medication that just covered it. Our entire class of 200-ish future pharmacists were always puzzled by how he made it into our school. Edit. Here are some more stories about him for those that don't want to look through my comments. He and I were supposed to be reviewing patient charts for our ICU rounds. Instead, he was shopping for a private plane he intended to buy after graduation. Why? He planned to work in a state that was in need of pharmacists, but live elsewhere and commute my plane. M was ejected from a following rotation site for sitting on a physician's car and smoking on a non-smoking hospital campus 3 times. The first 2 times I was told the physician was nice about it. The third time he was actually banned from the hospital grounds and failed the rotation. M walked across stage with us but didn't get a diploma that day, due at least to his failing in the above story. This caused drama in our graduating class as we collectively felt that if he wasn't graduating, he shouldn't be walking with us, especially since we all knew what happened at his rotation site, and he had been reported numerous times for attempting to cheat during exams. Group workshops with him consisted of him shopping online for leather jackets and motorcycles. Our university, however, let him walk under the reasoning that he paid his tuition, and his family was there to see him walk, and thus he was entitled to do so. About a week after graduation, M posted to our class Facebook group if there was some way he could sue our university or the federal government, OSH loan holders, to forgive his loan as he decided he no longer wanted to be a pharmacist and would essentially return his education. Since a lot of pharmacists are posting and it's a small world as we are all told, I'm sure at least one of you know exactly who I'm talking about. Story 16. I was a student in this class, but after an entire chapter of going over the Civil War in a history class, our teacher as a joke said, "So who won the Civil War?" A girl raised her hand and said, "The South." And he laughed until he realized she was serious, and she tried to defend it saying, "What, we still have slaves, right?" Edit. She was referring to still have mass slavery in the South. Story 17. History. Professor is talking about some expedition or something and mentions Antarctica, is standing in front of a world map. Girl raises her hand, asks, "Excuse me, but where is Antarctica?" Profess stands there unable to answer for a few seconds, then raises his arm to the map and goes, "Right here-y," while running his hand under Antarctica and making exaggerated Vanna White motions. Girl goes, "Oh, okay." I was a little scared. More for the professor. He had that "I am severely underpaid" expression. Story 18. I teach a class on the history of psychology. When covering the chapter on behaviorism and discussing the ideas of its founder, John Watson, who was a determinist, or shies, did not believe in free will, a student asked me in the middle of class that if he was a determinist, why did he advocate free will in the Sherlock Holmes book? I was really taken aback by that one. Story 19. Not a professor, but back when I was in high school, I was a library aide, and I was walking into classrooms distributing some books, and I walked into a class with the professor in the middle of an angry lecture on plagiarism, because one of the students turned in an essay that started with, "In my 25-plus years of experience in this field." Story 20. Not my story, but in a test where you could bring solved questions with you, a student brought a question identical to the one the test paper has. Instead of just copying the answer and getting an A, he glued the solution which he brought with him with a glue stick. All he had to do is not being lazy. Story 21. Had lots of students from Saudi Arabia. They typically pushed boundaries, so I learned quickly to set boundaries and be firm, fair with everyone in the class. One guy didn't see the need to come to class much or do homework, and his grade suffered greatly. He came in one day and said, "I want a better grade. My family is the XXXX's. I don't remember the name. But apparently they were wealthy and well-respected. I didn't care, and I reminded him of his lack of effort. He was pissed and he made some generic threats, but nothing specific I could call anyone about. I found out from the other Saudi students, most of which hated the guy, that he said it during the last week and went home without taking any finals. Maybe he was more arrogant, but I'd say he was also a... Story 22. I wouldn't say dumb, but definitely baffling and annoying. She had somehow gotten all the way to college still believing that weirdly and creepily exaggerated coy little girl flirting would get her what she wanted, including with female faculty. It was cringy to see in action, literally tilting her head to the side, playing with her hair, pivoting her leg back and forth mannerisms, combined with semi-childish speech patterns while glancing up through her eyelashes. Definitely. I'm only talking to this one in front of witnesses territory. She told me that she was reading and studying every night and still not making progress on tests and needed help. I explained how to make written study materials to help her absorb information better. She said she'd done that and reviewed the materials regularly, but still wasn't seeing results. Genuinely concerned and puzzled, I asked her to bring me her materials next class period, and we'd go over them to make sure they were accurate and useful. She agreed. Next class period rolls around. She announces, with even more exaggerated mannerisms, that wouldn't you know it? She was so frustrated with her score on her last test, returned before our earlier conversation, that she'd thrown her study materials into the trash in a fit of anger, and they were all gone. Almost as if they had never existed. I looked her in the eye and said, I think you should consider, then, that self-discipline may be playing a role in your grades in my class. She huffed and pouted in outrage, and I never saw her again. What makes me sad is that clearly someone, almost certainly her family, had taught her that these behaviors worked. No one sticks to a behavior that strongly unless she has had success with it. Story 23. We were discussing the three most common phases of matter: solids, liquids, and gases. Using water as the example, I asked a student to tell me what we call the solid phase of water. He replied, oil. I was dumbstruck, but mine was only temporary. Story 24. I am not a professor, but I watched one facepalm after my classmate said this. Ugh, I don't even know what a verb is. This was in an advanced linguistics course for would-be English teachers. Story 25. I had a student who tried to argue that plagiarism wasn't real after ganking the text of a one-page paper on velociraptors straight from a top Google search result for them. But if you read something, then you're just taking the knowledge and thumping it back into a word processor. What's the difference? She was a criminal justice major. Story 26. High school teacher. Many years ago, I was showing my students clips from Romeo and Juliet. Students stared at the screen in total bewilderment for a few minutes. Then she said, serious as a cancer diagnosis? How can he be in this movie? He died in Titanic. Edit. Why did my autocorrect change Romeo to Romero? Story 27. A few years ago, I had a student turn in a term paper titled Mental Disorders. They then went on to misspell disorder 2 different ways in the first sentence. Edited for spelling. Story 28. The one who would regularly hand in essays which were obviously copy-pasted. They didn't bother to change the font or color of paragraphs that were lifted from other websites. They never argued or shared their opinion, but would ask vague questions such as, but what is the United States? At the end of a lecture or tutorial that was about a legal decision. Story 29. Not a professor, but a high school math teacher. I had a student who answered a FaceTime call during the final exam. I just took her phone, told the person on the other end, not a smart idea, and hung up on him. I let her continue the test. Then I caught her cheating off the guy next to her twice, so I failed her. And if that wasn't enough, during the next period's final exam, she burst into the room on her phone yelling, "Sup, mister, always shamo." I just yelled, "Go away," and she left. Kid was so self-absorbed and clueless. Story 30. Not a professor, but in my AIT, MOS training, or your job for the Army. We had a guy get a 20 on a 100 PT grading scale for a simulated call for fire. Note, we were all becoming 13 Fs, forward observers, and this chucklefuck managed to miss 120 PTs on a 100 PT sim. He still ended up graduating. Story 31. Finally, a good one to speak to. There was this girl on the basketball team in college. Just to set the stage, the assignment was for creative writing 101 basically. Bring in an apple, write about it, place apple on the table with everyone else's apples, swap papers, find the apple that goes with the vivid description on the paper. Dumb brought in a pear from the tree near the mailroom. Tried hard to convince me it was a crab apple and that they weren't edible. RC, she even used pear-shaped to describe it. Her writing level was literally second grade at most. Wasn't even ripe. Story 32. A student once threatened to sue me over the definition of the terms necessary and sufficient that he had mixed up in an exam. No biggie to mix them up, actually for a math major it might be, but loudly threatening to sue me over an age-old textbook definition in an exam review session was kind of stupid. It did entertain all other students who were present. Another student once requested letters of recommendation for 5 of the top 10 master's programs in Europe, while being the second worst in his class of several hundred graduates. Story 33. My sister is a French teacher, not a professor, so I'm not sure if this counts, but here goes. Everyone in the class had a fairly lengthy piece of French homework, and one student put the entire thing in Google Translate, but translated it to Spanish. Story 34. I'm not a professor, but I studied modern languages at university and met a girl who had managed to spend an entire year abroad, a compulsory part of the course, living in the country where her language was spoken, working at a job with local people and sharing a flat with 3 local people. And after the year was up, her language skills had not improved one jot, and her flatmates had to talk to her in English because she couldn't understand them otherwise. I mean, I fully appreciate that some people find it much harder than others to learn a foreign language. That's not actually the part I find dumb. The dumb part is getting into 30K of debt and spending 4 years of her life on a degree, then putting absolutely zero effort into actually learning the thing you're paying to learn. Actually, to be that bad at the language after a full year, you'd have to make an active effort to avoid it. Never turn on a television or pick up a magazine. Spend all your time in English and Irish-themed pubs and ignore anyone who tried to talk to you. Story 35. Not a professor, and it didn't happen in college as well. But in my 4th year of high school, VWO for all the Dutch people here, a girl asked the teacher what Nazis were. Note that we had already discussed the Second World War in 2nd year of high school, and this is the Netherlands where the Second World War is often discussed in all kind of schools during our Remembrance Day. Story 36. Not a professor, but in my psychology class, there was this one girl that would ask questions every 3 minutes. Not the good questions either. You know? Like the ones where the teacher didn't full-on explain things or anything that would make the discussion better, just the type of dumb questions where the teacher had literally said what she was asking about 2 minutes ago. Anyways, we were viewing a map of cultural stereotypes, and in Mexico it said, maids and gardeners. Which, okay, fair enough, it's just a stereotype. But this girl legit looks at it, looks at the teacher and says, that doesn't make any sense because Mexicans don't have gardens. How can they have gardeners? As a student, I rolled my eyes. As a Mexican, I burst out laughing. JFC, I can't even be mad. I know she's not racist. She's just ignorant as. Story 37. All she had to do to graduate was to show up to a seminar. I pointed out the importance of this as it was the last time this mandatory thing was being run, and the last chance for her, having missed earlier opportunities. And I wouldn't run the class next year. Got an email saying she had a dentist appointment and missed it. She failed. Couldn't get her degree and had to come back 18 months later for it. Story 38. I am a high school teacher, and last year I curated a class where the boy would put all the effort he could into studying, but he just didn't have it. Failed math exam 3 times. Story 39. Not a professor, but in my statistics class, a girl asked if changing the minus to a plus would change the answer. Not a negative to a positive, like she wasn't questioning how negatives worked. She sincerely wanted to know if changing from subtraction to addition would change the answer. To the professor's credit, she answered with a kind yes, and only a slight pause. Story 40. Not a professor, but I am in graduate school. We are in a hybrid program, which means we do part online and we go to class 5 Saturdays a semester. One guy came to the first class, then never came back until the last class. We were having a final that day, which he didn't know because our midterm was take-home. He slept through the final. Even snored a few times and almost fell out of his chair. I don't know why he even stayed. Story 41. I had a student when I was a TA who took the first quiz in my class, but I realized he wasn't on my roster. I told him this, but he insisted he was in my section. Soon, he stopped coming to section altogether, but did insist on handing his exams and papers back to me in lecture. I eventually discovered he was supposed to be in my colleague's class, but never attended that either. After the final exam, which he handed in to me, he admitted to me that he had just realized he was in the other class and had been confused because his roommate was in my class, but I guess it doesn't really matter since I didn't really show up anyway. Story 42. Dumb isn't the correct term. Ignorant is more apt, and one of my 17-year-old homeschooled students was so ignorant it was scary. He read at 2nd grade level and couldn't count past 20, and basic arithmetic non-existent. Forget writing, as his hand spelling was also at 2nd grade level. John's mother homeschooled him and finally gave up on it at age 16-17 and enrolling him in our high school. My other students hated this sad kid, and he was always in fights, arguments with them. He threatened to kill one of his tormentors, and the guy laughed at him. I told this guy to cool it because, unlike many kids, John meant it when he said he'd kill him. Parents that elect to homeschool should be tested themselves, and periodic testing done on the student to see is they're progressing or not. Story 43. During an oral exam, basic engineering electronics, a girl could not answer a single question. So I ask her simpler questions. I bring close the oscilloscope and point at the power switch. It was pretty clear it was a switch as it was written in bold letters, on-off. And ask her what was it. Answer, fuse. Story 44. I was an adjunct after undergrad and occasionally during my master's. I taught a few sections of pre-algebra which no one tenured wants to deal with. Me. I'm actually required to put one question of this type on the final. Him. There's a final? It was mid-November. Story 45. Had a single mom who came to class 3 times total. The last time was for the final. She leaned across the desk I was sitting at and asked me seductively if there was anything she could do to pass. I literally laughed and told her to get thee away from me. Not only was she a fat slob, but she smelled like an ashtray and was one of the laziest students I'd ever had. She didn't even have a job. Still, she couldn't make it to class. We had free on-campus childcare FFS. She failed and lost her financial aid. Story 46. Not a professor, but I tutored athletes for 10 hours at a D1 school. 2 stories, same guy. 1. What does colonialism mean? I tried to explain a concept spanning thousands of years of human history in a sentence. Double-checked with his athletic counselor, and yes, English is his first language. 2. What does delinquency mean? It's for his class called juvenile delinquency. We're 2/3 of the way through the semester. He's been taking this class for months now. Attendance is mandatory for athletes, so I know he's been to this class. The sad part is that he was a product of terrible public schools his whole life and was told since puberty when he shot up to first Seventh that as an athlete, school was optional. And damned if he didn't graduate with the same degree as me. We walked next to each other at graduation. Story 47. Obligatory Kevin. Story 48. Not a professor, but I worked at my university's tutoring center while in college. Had one student who was a sports science major and would come in for tutoring for every single class. He had to do this because he was barely literate, as in reading maybe on a first grade level. One of his assignments was to write about an important African-American figure. He asked me what African-American meant. The student was African-American. For the record, I don't blame him for being dumb. I blame every single teacher he ever had whose responsibility it was to ensure that he was learning, and instead just passed him on so he would be someone else's problem. Edit. Upon rereading, I realized how harsh some of my comments sounded. For context, the school the student attended before college is known in my state for being terrible. Rough neighborhood, underfunded, less of a school-to-prison pipeline, and more of an express train. Also notorious for their poor staffing, mostly second-rate teachers who couldn't get hired anywhere else, or ones fresh out of college who quickly burn out and stop caring. I have the utmost respect for the hard-working, dedicated teachers who genuinely care about their students. You guys are heroes. Story 49. I taught calculus in college. There's always several students who are terrible lazy at the subject, but this term there was one who was really energetic about appearing to put in the effort, in multiple different ways, but I'll focus on one. I told the class I'd give them extra credit for doing any of the advanced problems at the end of the chapters. This guy turns in elegant, concise, handwritten solutions for all of them. That'd be hard even for me. He even knew how to do epsilon delta proofs. That's not something I taught. One of the problems involved a variable d and an epsilon delta argument. His proof contained the phrase, let E D, which is utter nonsense not only in context but in terms of an epsilon delta proof in general. It's supposed to be let E 0, without exception. He was copying from an instructor's solution manual without knowing the meaning of the symbols. I suppose this isn't dumb so much as shameless. Story 50. This happened in high school, senior year. Our teacher was talking about the phases of the moon, and this girl raised her hand and asked if other countries have moons too. She thought the moon was only for the US. Story 51. I'm a film student and we were asked to make up our own 10 rules to follow when making a film, much like the Dogma 95 Manifesto, and specifically had us refer to us as a manifesto. This one student submitted the Communist Manifesto instead. According to my lecturer, that student didn't do very well and is now a forklift operator. Story 52. When my mom was a history teacher at a local high school, they went on a trip to Spain. One girl, let's call her Megan, was not quite a clever student. They went to a restaurant to eat and Megan was looking at the menu. She was frowning the whole time and made some noises, and looked like she was struggling with the language. My mom told her there was an English menu on the other page because she didn't understand Spanish. 3 minutes later, she still looked confused. My mom asked her what was wrong. Megan then asked my mom why the English language was so different than they learned at school. Megan didn't understand a word. My mom looked at her menu, went quiet for a second, and told Megan she was reading the German menu. Story 53. Not a professor, but back in 8th grade, we were discussing the war in Afghanistan because of a "you are not dumber" question another student asked, when another girl, the principal's niece, looks puzzled. She raises her hand, looks the teacher in the eye, and says, "I thought Afghanistan was a city in Vietnam." Same year, we were talking about plate tectonics and the creation of mountains and hills. Another girl stops our teacher dead in his tracks and says, "But God created the mountains, you're a liar." Same class, our teacher was talking about his incredible life story, being a single dad, then being in the Air Force, and getting married to his high school sweetheart and having his second child nearly 20 years after his first. It was a truly great story, until one of the remedial, slow learning, basic class kids literally shouts, "So you did it with her twice?" His sister looked at him with the most annoyed expression, and all she said was, "Well, yes, that's how he has 2 kids, and it was probably more than twice." Story 54. This was just a one-time thing, because this kid is a pretty sharp student otherwise. I'm a flight instructor, and was trying to teach my student how to find your ground speed while flying. To do this, you take 2 points, towns usually, that you know the distance between and time how long it takes to fly between them. Okay, Bob. That took 7 minutes to fly between Bobsonville and Bobsville. The distance is 10 nautical miles. What is our ground speed? 5? 5 what? 5 minutes. No, your speed. Yeah, 5 minutes. So, since it took 7 minutes to fly 10 miles, then our speed is such that it took 5 minutes? Yeah. Story 55. Not a professor. Heard some arguing from the chemistry class with someone shouting, "But Mercury is a planet. How can there be 2 Mercuries?" Edit. Forgot the second part. Story 56. Obligatory. Not a professor here. But I remember one class we took an exam and were reviewing it after. Half of the class got one particular multiple-choice question wrong. The question? Name the 3 principles of sports media reporting. 4 choices. A had the first principle, B had the second, C had the third, and D was all of the above. Half of the class, in a college, made me facepalm so hard I nearly broke my nose. Story 57. Not a professor, but I once dated a girl that was dumb. Sweet, naive, but I mean, she was straight up stupid. So naturally, we convinced her that cats couldn't see themselves, or other cats, in mirrors. Her cat was stupid too, and never looked at itself in the mirror, so it was a running joke between my friends and I for quite a while. We had been dating over a year and decided to take astronomy together. A few weeks into the semester, we broke up, a bad breakup at that. So one day, I'm sitting in the back, she's way up at the front, in an armistice of learning as we are separated as much as possible. The professor, unfortunately, is talking about advanced telescopes and loves her cats, and uses her cat as an example to look through one of these reflection telescopes to see another cat in a spaceship or something like that. It was introductory, so she used these childish examples often. The whole class is pretty bored and lulled, but one little hand raises in the front row. I connect 2 and 2 and sort of slide down in my seat as I slowly realized what was going to happen. Cats can't see reflections, so your example won't work. A smug voice chimed in from the front. The professor stopped, not sure what just happened. Confusion at first, then she wasn't sure if it was some kind of prank. Once she realized my ex was serious, she snapped off something snarky and continued. My ex spoke up again, not to be dismissed, and the professor just rolled her eyes halfway through her sentence and asked, "What are they, vampire cats?" At this point, the entire class of 200 students is roaring laughing, so my ex stands up, gives me a glare that could melt stone, and stomped out of the class. Story 58. I'm not a professor, but a brother in my fraternity won the "most likely to be serving fries at McDonald's" superlative at the end of the year. He genuinely thought he earned the award because he liked French fries so much. Story 59. When I was working as a graduate assistant, the dean of the graduate school where I worked was reviewing the capstone projects of 2 police officers who were about to graduate with master's degrees in criminal justice. She quickly discovered that they had plagiarized. She figured this out because when she opened the electronic documents, there was a significant amount of text that was hyperlinked. The links brought her to Wikipedia. Story 60. I was not the professor, but perhaps the stupid student. I was taking a history class back in the mid-80s. As I was completing the final exam, multiple choice, answers on a Scantron answer sheet, I noticed all of my answers had a ghostly smudge beside them on the question sheet. Apparently, the professor took his old answer key and used whiteout to cover his tick marks beside the correct answers before making photocopies. I decided to leave one of the 50 answers incorrect for my personal edification.